complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right, Fritz Imperial, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. I've watched some of your streams and interviews lately, and I've been very impressed by a lot of the guests. And I'm like, I want in.
Oh, well, thank you so much, man. I'm trying to think. I found your stuff a while ago because, and I've said this multiple times, is that I had one foot in my door or 1 foot in the door rather when it came to kind of like the NRX sphere, you know, and it took me a while to kind of come around, but I became aware of, you know, people like you and Charlemagne and Dave, probably I want to say in like 2017, 2018. So I'm not going to say I've watched every one of your videos, but I was definitely aware of your
glad
work.
you
I
have
enjoyed it quite a bit. So anyway, for those who aren't, you know, immediately familiar with you, could you describe kind of like who you are and what you do?
Well, I run a terrible YouTube channel that you shouldn't subscribe to called Fritz Imperial, where it kind of evolved over the years, and like it's kind of a little stagnant now, and I'm trying to reinvent it of trying to figure out what type of content I want to make, because people like the political stuff. Like I was blown away by my most popular video by far is Why I'm a Monarchist, and I made that like 6 years ago. And you know, I'm thinking maybe I should do that, talk about history. I've wanted to do some video game reviews, but that's all stuff that I'm planning to do versus actually am doing right now. I know those are two different things, but yeah, it's a lot of just kind of ranting and nonsense by somebody who's just disillusioned by the way a lot of the modern political world is going.
So I'm curious, right? How did you end up, you know, making political videos in the first place?
So it started out where I was kind of raised as a normie con, right? And then went through a bit of a libertarian phase early in college, but then just kind of fell more into far right stuff. And, you know, I kind of had this idea in college of like, well, I have my own Christian faith and I have my own kind of fun little LARPy monarchist ideas. And like, maybe I could just kind of keep that as a personal thing and go to church and just, you know, the world can leave me alone. But I just increasingly saw that the early, you know, we used to call them SJWs, that stuff was creeping more and more. And I learned that, you know, it doesn't let anything go. It has to creep into everything it can get its hands on. And you know, I remember Gamergate as well, and it was happening in that sphere where, oddly enough, this little stupid spat over video game journalism kind of snowballed, or at least had an effect on how a lot of political discourse happened online. You know, it's where people like Sargon of Akkad got their start. But you know, I was like really taken aback when the church I was going to, which was part of the Presbyterian Church USA, said, "Yeah, we're fine with gay marriage now." I was like, "That's just fundamentally wrong." And then when the snapping point for me though was in late 2015. I was reading this article on a Christian website about how there was this kind of evangelical gathering somewhere in like Chicago area, and it became very controversial because they invited a bunch of like Black Lives Matter demonstrators, or they like the people on stage were wearing like Black Lives Matter t-shirts, and it was going to be a big thing for the event. And like it culminated in this overweight African American woman like giving this whole speech about like talking down to a crowd of young white evangelicals saying, "You're all complicit in white supremacy." And I'm like, this is just evil. And I'm like, I didn't see any other like Christian leaders at the time speaking out about it. And I'm like, well, if nobody else is going to, then I am. And like weirdly enough, like the tiny niche that I was trying to create when I started my channel was like criticizing the SJW stuff, where how it was infecting evangelicalism at the which I was part of at the time. I hadn't become Catholic yet, but then it kind of slowly changed into like I went from trying to bring like the stuff I learned from watching the skeptics like Sargon of Akkad, trying to bring that into Christianity, and then I turned into actually I've noticed, well, you have all these skeptic channels, all of them are atheists. They all came from the atheist community. Well, there's room for, well, you know, they all preach about wanting more intellectual diversity. So I'm like, well, here I am. And it kind of came across people like Dave the Distributist and this tiny little niche community of dissident right-wing Christian YouTubers formed. And it's kind of been rolling ever since.
It's interesting because I recently got a YouTube comment, and generally YouTube comments are trash, but this was quite this was quite on point. And basically, it just said libertarianism is middle school for someone on the far right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and everyone goes through it, and it's kind of uniquely, you know, embarrassing for all of us, or you know, I guess one way or another. So yeah, that's interesting. I had a similar experience. So in the sense that my fiance, her family is part of the Swedish Covenant Church, right? Which is, you know, essentially an offshoot of Lutheranism, specifically for kind of, you know, ethnic Swedes. And it's particularly popular again in Chicago. And this is one of these mainline Protestant denominations that has just gotten completely like chewed up and spit out by modernity, right? Like you can imagine in the Eisenhower era that these people would have been very solid, you know, conservative Americans. And, you know, kind of this mechanism of being, you know, good, respectable people, you know, has essentially walked these people to the point where, like you said, you know, they have these, you know, obese, you know, essentially like skin intellectuals, you know, just berating all of them, you know, telling them that they're horrible, telling them that they're
Problem is,
terrible.
these were the evangelicals, the ones that were
Right,
socially
yeah.
conservative on everything else. But I saw race at the whole race thing as the Trojan horse for them trying to shove other woke politics into it.
No, definitely. And I think that one of the things that pushed me to these spheres is seeing that the people who, you know, like these evangelicals who should be leading the charge, you know, had essentially, they were completely powerless. You know, they had no way to actually stand up. And I don't know, it's just interesting that we kind of both had that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, right? You said that you are a monarchist. You know, you said that's your most popular video. If you could you give kind of like a notebook sketch for why you kind of consider yourself, you know, a monarchist, and why you consider that kind of like the most, or like the best, like I guess, political camp to align yourself with?
Well, you know, I don't really consider it to be ideological so much as in like when you know, reading the ancients, reading philosophers like Confucius and Aristotle, and just, you know, looking at history, the fact that for like 5,000 years, the basic model for most human civilizations throughout human history has been some form of monarchy. And when you kind of look at it through traditional and classical philosophy and ethics, like placing like the family as the most important unit of society, well, that just fits right in part and parcel with monarchism, because it's not even so much a government rule by one person, it's more rule by one family. And, you know, it's something that isn't explicitly anti-modern in the sense that, you know, you can't have these childless, you know, older millennial women when you have if, you know, in a royal family, when the necessity of it mandates that they have to marry and have children. But that, and I just see that the alternative to it, you know, with the exception of like the Roman Republic or Venice, where yes, they were republics and they kind of had republican virtues, in no way could you consider them liberal in any sense. But in the Enlightenment, you had a break, and you suddenly had this class of psychopathic intellectuals, like people like Robespierre and Rousseau, and people who were really just trying to rage against nature and God and just the hierarchy that had been in Europe for 1,000 years. And you look at the results. You look at what happened in France, where you had decades of murder, bloodshed, and war. and so you could just kind of look at the history of liberalism or the people that oppose monarchy, and you just see a bloodbath marching through it every time it's been tried. The United States being the exception in a large part, just because it wasn't so much middle class bourgeois intellectuals trying to overthrow our rule. It was landed gentry our version of aristocrats. But you look at what happened in France, you look at what happened in Spain, you look at what happened even in World War One. Is one of the big things. It's kind of one of the reasons why I idolize, or I have a fondness for, say, the German Empire and Kaiser Wilhelm, is that the people that they were opposed to, at least by the end of the war, were people like Woodrow Wilson, were just psychopaths. They, basically had the idea that we don't care how much longer we are going to purposefully extend this war and kill as many civilians and soldiers as possible to achieve regime change. And it's like, that's supposed to be liberation. That's supposed to be, the rights of man. People are no more free once people just became ruled by a class of insane intellectuals, not by monarchs. And it just turned out worse for everybody.
Well, yeah, it's very much kind of this, and I don't mean conservative at all in a disparaging sense, but this kind of conservative argument that essentially, like, whether you like it or not, every system becomes, in a sense, an oligarchy anyway. That, like, technically we have a democracy, technically we have a constitutional republic, but effectively it's an oligarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Just the same as any other system is. And this is kind of one of the primary, insights of Moldbug, right? Which is this idea that, well, if you're going to have a system, you want to have the most formalized system you can, because then you actually know who's in power and who ought to be in power. Whereas now we kind of have this horribly, like, obscure, decentralized mess where you can never really tell who made any one decision.
It's why it makes me upset to no end whenever conservatives blame Joe Biden for anything, because that's exactly the point. Joe Biden is the senile puppet that is used for conservatives to vent their anger at, when clearly other heads at work are the ones causing the actual problems, but they're part of the faceless bureaucracy.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because to me, I was actually kind of, I don't want to say, I was influenced by monarchist thought at a very early age. George Bagby, who I've had on several times on this channel, he was an old high school teacher of mine, and he's essentially, or at least was very, very sympathetic to monarchism. And again, it's odd because there are kind of two ways to go about that. The way you've described, which is just like, well, that's how it kind of happens. That's just kind of the natural way of being, versus another one, which is like, I want to be king, which I think is a different category of, of person altogether. But to me, it kind of comes back to this idea that, and this is something that you see that the Catholic thinkers are very good at expressing, right? Which is this idea of subsidiarity. This kind of like great chain where, the authority shown within a family, the authority shown on a political level, the authority of the church and the authority of God are kind of descending mirror images of one another.
Confucius basically explicitly pointed this out in his 5 relationships. He wasn't even Christian, but he kind of nailed this 2,500 years ago. His idea of, you have these reciprocating relationships of the ruler and subject, husband and wife, older friend and younger friend, parent and child, and older sibling and younger sibling.
And in a way, either a rejection of God or rejection of the monarch, they're sort of the same thing. And you see this very much in kind of like the leftist desire from like the Frankfurt School types to bring that type of radical, like kind of like satanic liberation, even within the family. It's against authority, no matter what the source or what the context.
Mm-hmm. You're not deposing tyrants, you're imposing anarchy, which is even worse.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, kind of borrowing from the idea of Hobbes a bit is, instead of having, it would be better to have like one, even if it's a tyrant, one tyrannical leader than to have millions of people basically oppressing themselves because they think they have power.
That's an interesting idea.
But in reality, though, it's not even so much the mob oppressing itself. It's more that you have a bunch of people, like the French Revolution, right? It wouldn't have snowballed into anything more than a like peasant revolt about taxes if it didn't have like the leadership of the intellectual class at the time. And the intellectual class at the time was vastly worse than any of the peasants could have thought of, because, you know, these intellectuals who were preaching about freedom were marching innocent nuns to their deaths and like inventing a new calendar and a new cult of reason.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things that is, I think, interesting, right? Because the reason I don't use the word conservative when, you know, speaking about us and our friends is that we're really not anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult because oftentimes the concept of revolution and the concept of radical are synonymous. And I think that we need to be really careful around those terms because they're very much not the same thing. And that type of attitude you're describing in the French Revolution is very much revolutionary, right? It's that we will cast down the social order. You know,
Mm-hmm.
something new, something, you know, reasonable will be erected in its place. And on one hand, that kind of bears a passing resemblance to us. You know, all of us, despite our, you know, our different, you know, personal eccentricities, we want the world to be different.
Mm-hmm.
However, it isn't this kind of like utopian or satanic desire to avoid authority. It's that we want legitimate authority. We don't want no authority. And I think that that's an important distinction.
Yeah, it's we want in a position of actual proper order rather than trying to chase the illusion that we don't like. You know, again, going back to the Enlightenment thinkers, they had the stupid idea that, well, before civilization, people were like these peaceful hippie nudists living, you know, I don't know, in small tribes in like a paradise, when reality is just no. In fact, when we were living like that, the first thing we did was disobey God.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. One of the things, and this will seem like a radical, like, I guess, like diversion from our topic at hand, but it's actually quite, I think it's quite linked, is that there's something kind of common to our circles, which is on the face of it largely unrelated. But I think that there's kind of a through line in this, and that's that a lot of people in our spheres are interested in 40K, right? And in
Yes.
Warhammer. And I'm going to try to avoid, you know, the true autism of that. You know, I'm not going to ask you about, you know, your list or anything like that, you know, for the sake of everyone at home. But I do think that the concept of evil in 40K is kind of interesting. So, so do you think you could examine that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if Warhammer 40K is a refreshing take for science fiction, or it's really science fantasy, because for one thing, even as much as I like Star Trek, you know, Star Trek is the progressive utopian, you know, we're all atheists, super scientist explorers on the Enterprise, whereas 40K is just, you know, it's proposing or projecting a future in which there isn't liberalism, in which it's unthinkable that there would be liberalism in that. And, you know, you have these very stark realities of evil. The fact that actually, no, like, you couldn't have the Federation in Star Trek if the Klingons and the Romulans were all explicitly like, we want to genocide or enslave all humans. Federation wouldn't be peaceful and diplomatic at that point. And also the fact that you have literal demons and satanic monsters crawling out of the ground. You know, you can't really be rationalistic and atheists at that point. And again, like the in the Warhammer, both fantasy and 40K universe, like the depictions of essentially the four great evils are, I think, very apt. They're very real. You know, you have Khorne, who is the god of blood, who is a, you know, kind of the most stereotypical, looks like Satan, and is a god of war and bloodshed and violence, which, you know, people that have actually been in combat and in those situations know war is hell. I can't really quite comment on it, but I believe it when they say it. Tzeentch is the god of chaos. He is the god of, you know, change and deception and lies. Nurgle is the god of entropy, of rot and decay, and Slaanesh is the goddess of pleasure and pain and excess. And, you know, these are kind of four very real kind of realities that of evil that people run across. Like, you read about the 30 Years' War and you think, wow, yeah, Korn was definitely feasting on that. Or you look at, the kind of Bugman culture and entropy, and that's Slanesh. And, I like to pointing out, like, you can take some of the major lol cows on YouTube and connect them to to the chaos gods. And, the infamous Chris Chan seems to fit all four of them. But
Yeah, no.
in short, yeah, not to keep going on Warhammer 40K, because sorry, but you got me started. But it's a very very real representation of evil.
Well, and I think the other thing that's interesting about evil is that, and I think that we see this in kind of our own politics, is that good and evil are not. We don't live in a dualistic system. These are not equal and opposite reactions. That evil exists as a corrupting kind of entropic force on good, right? So for instance, right, in part of the reason in Warhammer, and the leftoids never understand this, right, that the good, quote unquote, faction, the Imperium, the human faction, is so brutal and so authoritarian, is that essentially, if you're not, hell will make itself manifest kind of behind your lies. Chaos will spring up. That evil is something you have to continually defend against. And evil, once it reaches a certain point, it's not something you can come back from. Oh, Fritz just dropped out. But I'll keep making my point and then bring him back on when he can. But anyway, essentially, evil is something that you have to purge. Once it reaches a certain point, you just dropped out for a little bit, but you're back now. It's something becomes unredeemably corrupted. Obviously, that's not necessarily a theological point, but I think it's kind of like a political one, that there is a point at which entropy overtakes a system and you just have to be done with it. So anyway, how much of that did you hear, Fritz?
I missed a few seconds, but yeah, I mean, the idea of entropy really does kind of resonate in the fact that, it is so easy. The Bugman lifestyle that the regime really wants people to fall into, like, they want that and they promote it partially just because it's easy. It's the fact that you're not putting in the effort. You're not, as I think Orwell and Good would have put it, you're not being low time preference, right? And I mean, what scares me, like I kind of had an idea for a sci-fi book or a story where, the liberal end goal is everybody gets willingly walks into the matrix and they get plugged into the pods that just drip feed them dopamine until the end of the universe. And you just have kind of a group of survivors who have rejected it living in the ruins of the earth, and they're trying to decide whether or not they should like pull the plug on the whole thing and put people out of their misery or let them stay in the pods. Like this, the funniest thing about the Matrix is that it seems like nowadays, 24 years later, you really wouldn't actually have to force people to walk into it.
Right. Yeah.
It's like this, it's almost like this, like, rapture that I think a lot of the progressives have, where they think that if we just can get to AI singularity, if we can get to some form of technological change, like we could be put into the pods and we'll either wake up in like, anime isekai fantasy world that is both looks, like a high fantasy world, but everyone is weirdly progressive, or we're going to wake up on the bridge of the USS Enterprise. And, they're kind of taking this like Egyptian mindset to it, like the afterlife, where it's like they want to have their tiny pods that are lined with their Funko Pops, and they want to take that with them to the grave. Like, they're taking their Funko Pops, they're taking their, their graphic T-shirts, they're taking all of that with them, even though, they're not waking up on the bridge of the Enterprise. And even if they did, none of them would accept them into Starfleet. No way.
Sorry, I just had to mute myself to sneeze. What I think you're getting at there is kind of two things, which is one, I think that the baby boomers are terrified of their own mortality. That they never wanted to grow old, that they certainly never wanted to die, and they're kind of facing that. I think the other one is that our regime they kind of bought their own pack of lies, to be honest. And they bought this idea that line go up forever, that
Mhm.
technological progress would essentially deliver them from all of the bad decisions that they made 10, 30, 40 years ago.
They thought that, okay, we've killed God. We don't need God anymore. We don't need any of our traditions. Just so long as the GDP can go up, we can basically create heaven on earth, but they're
Right,
really creating
exactly.
hell.
And I think that the problem is that not only has it become very clear that, well, okay, like maybe we kind of needed, and I realize this could be taken sacrilegious. I'm deliberately being flippant, but the idea that we actually needed God for something, but also that the eternal like wellspring of prosperity seems to be running dry,
Mhm.
and so that thing that kind of
I
like,
wouldn't say it's running dry. I'd say it's running bitter.
mm,
It's not like because it seems like the government seems to be managing to weather crisis after crisis. It's getting weaker, but like they still seem to be managing to keep the economy up. But it just I don't know how long people can be miserable because we can show now objectively that people are going to be living shorter lives. They're going to be poorer. They'll be lonelier. And they'll be sicker and they'll be more mentally unwell, and yet they're still kind of siphoning off of or they're still kind of trying to milk from the regime's teats, but
well,
that
I
milk
think
is
that,
the milk's gone sour.
right. Well, I also think that it's just become harder to get, in the sense that the IQ is becoming more and more of a wealth like stratifying measure, right? That look, like I think of people like actually I won't say it because some of my family members listen to it. There are people in my family who are older and by no means stupid, but not educated, right? They just never really did much school, and they were able to do perfectly well for themselves. And the ability for people who aren't educated and credentialed to make good money to access the kind of like promises of the regime, I think is shrinking. And so I think that what AI offers these people is essentially a way, and this is also why I think you see a lot of the sustainability talk, is a way that the people at the top can have all their problems solved and continue living in luxury, right? So it's like, oh, whatever, the singularity will be the thing that ushers in, gay space communism.
Hmm.
It turns out that Obama wasn't able to do it. It turns out that, Bernie Sanders wasn't able to do it. And of course, I'm using that phrase kind of as a joke, but it seems to me that the eternal like promise of, the utopia over the next hill, just another $1 million or just another, program for impoverished youth, I think that is ringing more and more hollow.
Yeah, and I think like just go back to the I guess uh wells run dry analogy. I actually might want to change kind of what I said. It's not so much that it's gone bitter, it's that the illusion's starting to break. It's starting to
Mm-hmm.
fracture that this isn't, this isn't the fountain of youth, that they're basically been sold snake oil, but it's such a good con that the people selling it actually believe it works.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know. I'm curious to see how this will develop over the next couple of years, because I think there's a tendency to be the Cassandra, to say like, oh, it's the end of the world is nigh, and I think there's a certain amount to which that's overblown.
I think something like that could happen. Like, like a nuclear war breaks out, Lord forbid. Yeah, that would usher in, an extreme and rapid collapse. But on the other hand, like I just kind of see it as society will continue to decay around us, and the people that rely on the system, you're just going to get you're going to get people that are either just such diehard believers that they're going to go with it and be pod people until they can't even afford to be pod people. But as we've seen in Canada now, like the horrifying legalization of euthanasia is starting to offer a solution to that. And we're getting this kind of weird situation that the elites want, because it seems like they want as a society that is in just complete stasis, in which kind of the cycle of life is is kind of stalled indefinitely, where you have, these aging boomers live longer and longer, even if they're not even really living, even if they're just completely senile. Like, you see so many of the leaders now are just so old, like a Joe Biden, even though I've said earlier he's not really a leader, but he's a good example. You know, like, and even Donald Trump is good, would be 80 into his presidency, and it's like, do we not have anybody younger? And the younger people are the insane, millennial drama students, but they don't want anybody to die of old age anymore, and they don't want anybody born. They just kind of want, and they don't want people becoming adults. They want anybody that's younger to kind of eternally remain a teenager.
And I think you see this very, very clearly with higher education, right? So there's this push to send everyone to college. And when you're in college, well, really, you should be getting a graduate degree. And really, you should be, kind of like extending your time in this essentially like eternal like adolescence forever.
You should continue to feed debt into the banks as well.
Well, not only feed debt, but I think there's also a part of it which is keeping people out of the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
That there's just not enough productive work to, I guess, reward, quote unquote, the people who go through the university system. Mm-hmm. And so there's an incentive to just keep them there, keep them
and then
away from.
Have you heard like the term adult daycare, where they
exactly.
They describe some jobs where, now it would be nice if you had a lot of these perks, certainly, but like, at a point, like, I don't want to feel like I'm being babied. I like the idea that after I'm done at work, hey, I was productive today. I did something useful and contributed to society, but yeah, sorry, that was kind of what I was thinking exactly of, like, trying to extend being either an older teenager or a young college student as long as possible, even when they have to enter the workforce.
Yeah, no, and I think you see it particularly around a lot of the language about like antinatalism and having kids, right? It is because again, there's these kind of like three traditional archetypes of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and it's the idea that we can freeze you as the maiden forever. In some cases, literally, freeze your eggs. And again, there's a lot of kind of like bitterness around this issue in our spheres, and maybe fair enough. But to me, it's like these people are being sold a lie, and they're not being sold a lie that's kind of harmless or, like inconsequential. They're being sold a lie, which is genuinely just ruining our society.
Yeah, it's their the liberation they're offered is, okay, what I think G.K. Chesterton made a point where it's like, or somebody said like, feminism is the lie that like women are slaves when they serve their family, but free when they serve their corporate masters.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and it's just thinking about like it's eternally wanting people to be babied and to like like, just like you see all the people with the Funko Pop collections. Now it's fine to collect stuff. Like, I have a huge collection of books, am I ever going to get through all of them? Hopefully one day, but I haven't. I certainly have a lot of work to do. But at least with books or like movies, you can watch them, you can do something with them, and you can like share them. You can't do anything with them. They're just a symbol of I support brand. A brand on two levels. I support Marvel IP and I support the Funko Pop company. And it's that, and like, if you've seen like McDonald's is like bringing adult Happy Meals now, so you can like relive nostalgia. It's going back to like, again, the Egyptian thing where the pharaoh needs to be buried. Like, you have a society completely obsessed with not just so much death, but as like mummification of, I need to be buried with all of my toys, and I want to live in this isolated little pod as long as possible, surrounded by useless plastic.
Well, and again, I think that and this is a point that that Thomas has made, where essentially it's like after World War II, we decided that we wanted to live in pointless societies. That no one could really answer the question other than just increasing biomass, why this society ought to exist. And I think that we had a brief substitute of consumerism, that like, oh, well, you exist to make yourself happy, to make choices, to kind of self-actualize.
You exist to be your true self, man.
Right. And that didn't work great, but it worked well enough. And then the problem is, all of a sudden, it's like with every additional copy, it started working less and less well.
And in a way, you kind of had, that's where like partially kind of where New Age stuff came from, is like people got disillusioned with a lot of the consumerism, and they wanted some form of spirituality, but they were so indoctrinated against Christianity that they decided to choose literally anything. And I find it funny that you have all these like liberal white people think that they're Buddhists and like, oh, Buddhism is so much more peaceful, when no, there's a horrible, torturous hell in Buddhism where sinners are tortured forever. But it's just they will believe literally anything other than what made their ancestors happy.
Right, exactly. They're incredibly open-minded to everything but what they came from. It's this radical preference for the other and like the exogenous that is truly odd. And you even see it in, and this is a topic I have to be gentle about, but in depictions of different cultures, right? So this meme that like certain groups have no culture, but other people, look at how vibrant and fun and cool it is. But anything about, that's gay. That's lame. You have to stop doing that.
Because they think of white culture as late 20th century homogenized American consumerism. They don't see, actual authentic European diaspora culture, which it makes me like discovering old traditional American, like American culture. To me, like, conservatives need to stop thinking of it as freedom and the American flag and politics. No, like, here's the thing. Yeah, Edgar Allan Poe, that's American culture. H.P. Lovecraft, that's American culture. You have actual works that come from a genuine and specific identity that have been just kind of been cast aside or become bland and mass produced.
Right. Yes. No, I think you're correct there.
Like with Lovecraft, right? Is everybody, all modern horror or so much of modern horror is inspired by him, but everybody kind of likes the idea of H.P. Lovecraft, of this kind of edgy atheist living in like the early 20th century and able to write about the unseen horrors, but nobody actually likes the culture that produced him, of this extremely conservative Yankee New England culture, and they certainly don't like his politics.
This is probably a shameful admission. I've never read any of his work at all. I have no exposure. I know I should. I was just talking. I had a Twitter space last night. I read 32 books and almost 10,000 pages last year, and I'm still so far behind. Like, I'm just frantically trying to catch up.
I just completely cleared my reading list, and I'm just like, I'm just gonna like start with, here's just a few books that I'm gonna make myself read this year, and like I'm starting with a biography of Jacob Fugger, who was the richest human being who ever lived. He was a German banker in the Renaissance who had estimated net worth of about $400 billion and had about 2% of Europe's GDP at the time owned by one person. And it's like, you read about that and you're like, man, I wish there was people like that today. Like the Renaissance, especially, there's such a vibrancy and confidence in civilization at that point. Even when you have like the Reformation right around the corner, the Turks have overrun Constantinople and are closing in on Central Europe. People in Spain and Italy and France and England and Germany just had this vibrancy of, we can just go out and sail all the way around the world just because we can. And you just see today that there's no steam left.
Yeah, I mean, it really it feels like watching someone with dementia die. Where they're just like slowly slowly forgetting themselves. And that's sad. Like, don't get me wrong, but to me, there's a certain point where, just like we can look at kind of the baby boomers and say like, all right, like it's time to give up on this. You know, this thing is done. To me, that's how I can't help but feel about people who are still like really, really attached to, you know, these are like cultural institutions, you know, who are like really attached to kind of things like the American Constitution or things like that. That, don't get me wrong, they have their pluses and minuses, but at this point, I just can't help but look at it like they're dead. You know, they're gone. No one really believes in them anymore. And I don't think you can swim upstream in that way. I think entropy is kind of taken hold. And I think that at a broader civilizational level, it's kind of like we're just too apathetic to stop it. It seems like
what's kind of needed is to have a clean break away from it and say, now, like, I was thinking you should have like a sort of monuments men for like the Confederate statues where like they break into like the African studies museums and like steal them back and just put them on private land, or like, but in the sense of taking aspects of our culture that are timeless and not related to politics. So like, I was originally going to call my H.P. Lovecraft video like why Cthulhu is better than the Constitution, or he's more enduring than the Constitution, because that's an actual work of culture, not a work of political theory that was applicable at a certain time by a certain people and doesn't mean anything now. And so like, you know, as like, especially like what Dave the Distributist is trying to put forward, and what your previous guest we're talking about, deatomization, detachment, and trying to create new societies. Just, I don't want to, you know, completely forget and forego the West. I just want to preserve what we can from it. But, you know, we should just kind of abandon these institutions that were once great, but are now decaying and actively trying to kill us.
I think that's well said. So Fritz, I'm starting to come down with something, so we might have to do a little bit shorter episode.
That's fine.
But if you could you tell people, you know, where they can find you and hear more of your work?
No.
All right. Well, fair enough.
No,
I will do it for you.
Kidding. You can find me on at Fritz Imperial on Twitter, where I will post a bunch of nonsense. You can look at my YouTube, Fritz Imperial, as well. I keep trying to decide, do I want to stream more on Twitch or on YouTube itself? Twitch seems to just be more where you should stream, but YouTube is where I actually have my subscribers. So, yeah.
And again, thank you for coming on. Like I said, I particularly enjoyed your videos on, obviously on monarchism, but also on Lovecraft, because as someone who has kind of put him on the back burner for a long time, you know, that video really convinced me to check him out. Because
as a first time, I would recommend, I mean, the first one I read, or you can listen to a whole bunch of it on audiobooks as well, and there's like, you know, guys reading it in the voices, and it's pretty good. Is like either the Dunwich Horror or Shadow over Innsmouth are really good.
All right, that's actually the second Shadow over Innsmouth reference of the last 24 hours, because someone I was on with Yiz the Eunuch, and she mentioned that's what Lori Lightfoot looked like. Is one of the creatures from Shadow over Innsmouth.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was about to spoil it, but yeah, no, read it for yourself.
I'm going to be honest, I didn't get the reference past it being Lovecraft, and I was like, all right, well, that makes sense. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on. And as far as my links, guys, you know where to find me. The show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and also Odyssey. You know, I've decided to start backing it up there, and I encourage people to check me out on alternative platforms, because I have done pretty well on YouTube. You know, it's growing, and I really appreciate that. I feel like my days are numbered, so to speak, and so I'm kind of trying to push out into other areas.
And the cops are coming for you, as I can hear.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. Anyway, in addition to that, if you want to support the show, I always appreciate it. I don't expect it, but the benefits you get is that you get to hear pre-recorded episodes early. So, for instance, if you're hearing this episode early, it means you support me, and I appreciate that. But anyway, guys, it was really good to speak with you, Fritz.
Yeah, thank you very much.
To everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.